what does Google's book of business look like? And what we found at that time was that it wasn't extremely diverse, and Google was missing Black advertisers, was missing Black small business owners for various reasons. The message wasn't reaching them.
So I want to start this off with a question for you, Jewel. So you've had this amazing career, having started a startup and sold it to Amazon, and then you go on to run Google for Startups as a few years ago. I want to say 2 years, maybe now. It's
Yeah,
been two
almost
years.
2 years, which is wild.
Yes. So how do you reconcile, in your brain going from starting something, this idea that you had with your partners to build this wonderful technology, to then using a lot of those bruises and war wounds that you had to go help other startups and other Black founders be able to build their things? Like, how do you think about that in your mind, like with whatever your mission was with your career?
Yeah, the bruises were motivation. I didn't want other people to have the same knocks that I had in my journey. And so it was pretty clear to me what I needed to do next. I saw that there were big problems, the problems that I experienced when I was growing and building my company, that I needed to go and solve. And so, being the entrepreneur that I am, I needed to go and attack those problems. And I saw taking on the role as head of Google for Startups as a great platform and a great way to attack the problem head on and have the power and the might of Google behind me. And so I've been fortunate for the timing to be sitting in the seat that I'm in as head of Google for Startups at this particular time where entrepreneurs, particularly Black entrepreneurs, have really needed the support. And so it's been a big blessing to be in the seat that I'm in and be able to create things like the Black Founders Fund, to support our entrepreneurs and make sure that they can not just make it through the pandemic, but actually thrive, and come out even stronger on the other side.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about, the opportunity we have to come out better than we did going into the pandemic. And we're going to certainly talk about the Google for Startups, the funds that, Google has committed to this initiative as well. But I'm interested, before we go there, and I asked this question of another recent guest on the show, is we know that sexism exists in venture capital. We know that racism exists in venture capital, Jewel. Like, what other things beyond racism and sexism would you say Black founders particularly perhaps have against us, whether it be because we aren't getting the same level of education? Like, what other things are there that keep us from raising significant amounts of money to be able to fuel our ideas?
I mean, racism and sexism are pretty much the foundation to a lot of the problems that we see in the industry. But I think offshoots of that are the closed network that exists in the venture capital space. And, it's like I said, the root of it is in racism and sexism. But if you look at it, it's really like, for so long, the industry has been based on who do you know and who can vouch for you. And that, has caused these very, very insular networks. And it's caused, the people that are able to raise money and the people who are writing the checks to both look pretty much the same for a pretty long time. And so I think that breaking that up and coming up with new solutions that allow more people to have access in, and allow different types of problems to be solved. I think one of the things that I'm really proud of in the work that we do, and that Joey has led in particular, is that we're really focused on entrepreneurs and founders who are solving real problems, who are looking at, I think about an entrepreneur like Jasmine Crow, who, driving in downtown Atlanta, saw that homelessness was a huge problem and hunger was a huge problem, and set out to solve that particular problem. I mean, hunger is crazy that that's still an issue where we have so much here in the United States, but we still have so many people that are going hungry. And so, looking at solving those types of problems. And so I think that's something that we as Black founders in particular, we have even more insight into some of the the deep societal issues and are building great technology, and that's what needs to be funded. And so that's really the motivation behind a lot of the work that I do.
And Joey, it's such a great segue, as Jewel does so eloquently often, is that, the relationships thing. And the relationships is why you started Goodie Nation. And it was to, provide ecosystem for entrepreneurs, particularly Black entrepreneurs, to be able to have the relationships that help them, get funded, get the education they need to, build the partnerships that they need for their ideas, to their startups to thrive. If you talk about what Goodie Nation has been able to do. First of all, let's explain what Goodie Nation is for this audience. So for people in Atlanta know, and people increasingly outside of Atlanta know what Goodie Nation is. But let's talk about what this is first before we go deeper.
Yeah, so we are a nonprofit, again, based in Atlanta, but with roots now nationally, that's focused on closing what we call the relationship gap for diverse founders and social entrepreneurs. So we're hyper focused on introducing them to key influencers in tech for advice, for capital, for professional development, and then also for talent.
So how do you get over? It's one thing to know people who have the keys to be able to get you what you need. But as we've seen throughout the last several years, particularly since COVID, we see a lot of diversity theater, right? We see a lot of people who will say, I'm going to do a $10,000 grant program to founders, and you know how far $10,000 will get you, Jewel. For some people,
Right.
for some people that may be okay, but it can be diversity theater in so many respects because it's not meaningful to a $1 trillion balance sheet. Google is doing something different though. But before we talk about that, I want to talk about the relationships and how key they are, and how do we know they're meaningful relationships in the beginning when we have so many people who will discount our ideas before we get even an opportunity, because so often we may not have the same amount of traction as some of our counterparts might with our startups. So how do we know, Joey, that these relationships are with pure intent?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, and Jewel hinted at it, it's at the end of the day, will people stand up and vouch for you? Will they put their reputation on the line to get you money, to get you a contract or a pilot at a large company, to get you a partnership and stuff like that? And one of the ways you can measure it is how fast those relationships actually, or how fast the decisions actually kind of play out. I think it actually speaks to a part of your earlier question around racism and things like that. At the end of the day, what we see, if there is a lack of trust between Black founders and those that are influential in tech. And so when there's not a lot of trust, and even going back to some of your previous podcast guests, non-diverse founders will get funded with something on a paper napkin, but you'll take the same exact concepts, same exact concept with something much further along, and diverse founders can't get it. And so to me, that speaks to a lack of trust, which is a much larger issue to tackle.
So, Jewel, why is it important for companies like Google to reach back into particularly Black startup founders? And is it a strategic mission to build these companies, help them grow because it's socially good, or is it a strategic mission because Google says, if we raise them up, we could potentially have valuable partners? So, like, if you think about why Google gets involved, what's the mission here?
Yeah. I mean, I think there is some kind of goodness behind it, and we want to help the community, but there's also a clear business imperative. And just to say a little bit more about the team that I lead specifically, Google for Startups, we didn't just show up during the pandemic. The team has been around for almost 10 years at this point. I've just been leading it for 2 years. And with me coming in, we have a focus now more in the US, whereas before the focus was primarily on emerging ecosystems outside the US. So that's why the name Google for Startups may be new to some people. But the mission has been the same for the entire time, which has been around leveling the playing field, and particularly for diverse, underrepresented founders. And so with that as the mission, that has led us to the work that we're doing now and led us to say, okay, we were doing a lot of support for organizations that support entrepreneurs and not the direct support working with entrepreneurs. But when I came in, we decided that we wanted to make a little bit of a shift and work directly with startup founders and understand what their problems were and how we could be supportive of them. And so that is what that insight and that work that we were already doing with the founders is what situated us to be in perfect position to say, oh, wow, these founders are not getting PPP loans at the same rates as their majority counterparts, or these founders are having to make really difficult decisions about what is their business going to look like in the midst of a pandemic? How are they going to pivot? How are they going to make sure that they're online? And so we were able to see that in real time and put together this, Black Founders Fund as an answer to some of the problems that we were seeing that the founders were going through at, last year. And so the reason to do that is because, of course, my thought was, well, I can't run programs if none of the companies are alive. I can't, what is my job going to be if these companies aren't here? And so it was really in response to what I was seeing and saying, okay, well, we want to support, but we have to do it in a much bigger way. And that's where you get the Black Founders Fund. And the other piece to it was, in order for us to sustain the support and not just do it as a flash in the pan, one-time thing, which to your point, we have seen from companies where they made a big announcement or a big proclamation and then we haven't heard anything from them. In order for us to sustain the support over time, that's where I had to bring in the troops and call Joey and say, hey, I need your help on this because I know that you are so good at providing this kind of community support and cultivating community among founders. And so that's why we partnered together on this initiative.
So for Jewel, for Black founders who may not be creating the next type of Google, these big, massive companies, so many of us feel like, because I'm not doing that, but because my, market is, my community, we often don't feel like a Google would be around to support us, right? And so is it that we are not solving big enough problems at scale that enough Black founders engage? Or is it that sometimes we as Black founders don't really see how big our market could be if we, had the support economically and support resource-wise to be able to tackle a bigger problem than we even knew we could tackle?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I love, and I'm actually rocking the shirt today, if y'all can see. This is from one of our companies, one of our companies that we support called Just Add Honey. And they are actually a local business here in Atlanta with brick and mortar stores, a really delightful tea shop on the Beltline in Atlanta. And they were one of those businesses when we first met them that, would consider themselves not to be a tech company, not to be a tech startup. But they were super smart about how they made a pivot during the pandemic to get their product out to the masses when they had to shut their local doors. And so that was the spark that made us say, okay, this is a company that can have the scale and can have the reach across the world when you think about how they're thinking about logistics, getting their tea out to everyone. And that's the type of company that we want to support. So it's not just the high tech startup. Of course, we focus our attention on those, but it also is how, as a local business, are you thinking about scale? That's really the determining factor as far as whether or not Google for Startups particularly can support or Goodie Nation can support, is how are you thinking about scale and impact on a level that's beyond your street corner. And not to say the businesses on the street corner aren't worthy of support. We have something for that too. Google for Startups may not be the right home, but we have something called Grow with Google, where we have local digital coaches that are in different communities like Atlanta, like Houston, like New Orleans, who are there on the ground helping those businesses figure out how do they get online, how do they market to their customers. So my overall message for all Black-owned businesses is digital is now, and you have to figure out how are you going to leverage the technology that's in front of you to grow and scale your business, even if scale for you does not look like, getting your product out worldwide, but it looks like getting your product to the people in your neighborhood. Even that means you have to take a look at what is available to you, what resources can you pull in to maximize the potential that's in front of you.
Joey, I would love your comments on this because, I've talked about this often. I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up in Toledo, Ohio. And it wasn't until I moved to Atlanta, forever ago, for some time that I saw Black people, Black men particularly, who were younger than I was, who were doing it. Like they had the big cars, nice houses, and et cetera. And they had nothing to do with music, nothing to do with sports, and they weren't selling drugs, right? But becoming from where I came from, I didn't see with my naked eye that type of opportunity around me. And so what Jewel mentioned this early in one of her opening comments about, the opportunity COVID provided for potentially some of us to be able to come out stronger than we went in. With the company that she just mentioned, Just Add Honey, how do we get to a place to where it doesn't take a pandemic for us to realize that there's a bigger opportunity for our businesses until we get no other choice?
Now, great question, and I want to point out like that Just Add Honey team is awesome. I had a pleasure to get to know Jamel over the past year, and one of the best leaders I think I've ever seen, quite honestly. And he and his wife are an amazing example of how we can take small businesses, which actually in many cases in the tech space are looked down upon as, and use
lifestyle companies.
Right.
Lifestyle companies. Yeah.
I'm actually on a mission to like eradicate that phrase. Like we've actually at Goodie Nation, we've actually have the term now multi-million-dollar a year business, because at the end of the day, to 99.9% of all humans on this earth, you are successful. But it's only in the scalable tech startup space where you're looked upon as a failure. And so the interesting opportunity is to take the Just Add Honeys of the world, those who have made it, who have been successful, who brought in revenue, but may not necessarily understand how to scale a little bit more, whether that's to a state level, national level, or regional, national, and then global. Do some education there, provide them the tools in order to do so, and then watch them grow. I think we'll actually create more Black millionaires that way than in some cases taking the tech startup founder, because you're gonna see awesome tech startup founders do their thing, right? That's fine. But I think there's a huge opportunity, a huge target market there of small business owners that we can help grow.
Yeah, but if I listen to Jewel's story, let's say I am, that Just Add Honey, or I am that, guy down the street who has an amazing print shop, who printed the tee that she's wearing, right? But let's say I hear her story, I'm automatically like, I'm never going to build something as big as she built to be able to sell to an Amazon. I'm just, doing my couple $100,000 a year, probably a couple $1 million a year thing. What do we have to do to amplify those same sort of celebrity statuses that a Joey has, that a Jewel has, in smaller enterprises that are completely viable, to your point, 99.9% of people, that's success?
For me, I think it's helping people understand the reframing of the problem, and I love Jewel's story because it's called it's something that I call obvious, non-obvious problem, where have the lived experience through either yourself, a parent, a grandparent. You also marry that experience with what you're seeing at work, something that people see on a daily basis. For me, with Part Pick, it's like we see that every single day we pass by a refrigerator, a washing machine, so on and so forth. But how many people thought to actually solve the problem the way she started to solve it? So it's obvious, but it's not obvious. And so for me, you're taking the person with the print shop, helping them to understand how to identify problems they're seeing on an everyday basis and turn that into a scalable tech startup idea that may be worth $50 million, $100 million a year one day.
Drew, I want you to chime in on this because there is a thing about us feeling like because I'm not going to, it's like, because I can't run 10 miles, I won't run one mile. So if I can't build $1 billion business, I'm not going to spend the time to go build one that could be $1 million business. But both of them have value. But I want my story to be your story when my story's got to be mine.
Yeah, that's the thing. People have to get out of, I want my story to be your story to be my story. We are all running different races and we have different experiences. But having the idea that there is value in what I'm experiencing and what I've lived is so important. And to Joey's point, I was going to reference my story too, because if I had not observed my grandfather, who was a farmer, and on one side, and my other grandfather who built convenience stores and laundromats and regular everyday businesses, I would definitely not be in a position to understand that it was possible even for me to start something. And so even if it's not you, the person that has the barbershop on the corner, or the print shop, even if you're not the one that starts the multi-million dollar scalable tech company, the person underneath you, the person, the apprentice, or your child, or whoever is looking up to you, they're seeing that it's possible, and then they may be the one. So you're planting seeds, or you're planting seeds for yourself. To Joey's point, if you're in a business and you've worked in it, we're looking at a company right now to invest in, where the company has been a family business for a long time, and the kids are looking to spin out technology from that kind of regular, everyday brick and mortar family business. And so you never know who you're inspiring and who's going to come up next. And that's where we go back to talking about legacy. And what we need so much in our community is that we not throw away the stuff that we're good at and the stuff that we've done for generations in service of what we see now is popular and flashy on TechCrunch and all of that. We have these fundamentals of business. We are entrepreneurial people. So making sure that we maintain that and use that as experience and leverage going into some of these technology ideas.
You know, you mentioned this a little bit ago, Joey, how you got involved. Jewel picked up the phone and said, yo, I got something. Google is big enough to do this on their own. Why is it important that Google has said, we're not going to do this on our own? We're going to put our tentacles out, in the community, people really doing the work to, be part of this. Why is that important?
To be clear, I asked myself the same question when they called me as well. This is to be totally honest. But no, so I think there's a few things. One, it shows the commitment of it takes the village to do this thing correctly, right? Google can do a lot of great things. When you start bringing in the community, you go from community building to ecosystem development, and that's how we create a lot of impact. But also, I think there's a hidden part of this, and then in many cases, the story around Black startup founders gets told all the time, right? And the lack of funding for them. But for organizations like a Goodie Nation, Black-led nonprofit, so on and so forth, in many cases, we face an even steeper challenge when it comes to funding and support and so on and so forth. So when a Google for Startup comes in and puts the stamp of approval on a Goodie Nation, it actually has the same effect when Google for Startup puts a stamp of approval on a nonprofit like a Gooder, or excuse me, a startup like Gooder, like a mini city, so on and so forth. And so you create this interesting dynamic where we really appreciate Google for Startups. The founders really appreciate Google for Startups. Google for Startups creates an amazing model, quite honestly, for how to build community and create impact in a sustainable way.
Jewel, I wonder what Google thinks about like this concept of a double bottom line, right? Like so often we hear of Black-owned companies, Black-started companies that might be creating worthy enterprises. It might be socially viable, but maybe won't be the next Google, right? But we play in the game of capitalism, and especially if you're talking about getting venture capital dollars, and you notice VCs don't want their money back. They want 10 times their money back. They want 100 times their money back. So how do we think about creating enterprises that are socially viable, but may not be, the biggest exit for, the founders or the investors?
Yeah, I mean, the impact story and what happens when you fund Black founders was a core design principle in us putting together the Black Founders Fund. We interviewed all of the recipients and we saw a through line that was pretty much consistent across the board, which is every single founder that we talked to they had a reason for being, a reason for doing what they were doing that was beyond what's on the surface. It was beyond, wanting to make the next great tech product. And it had to do with the communities that they came from. It had to do with, wanting to make sure that the road was a little bit easier for the person coming behind them. It had to do with wanting to make sure that the industry became more diverse. I just got off a call with Chisa, who's building a company called Pedal, and he's created this really unique way of diversifying large companies through scholarships. And so that through line that we saw, where we knew if we give dollars to these companies, it's not going to end there. These folks are going to multiply it because they're going to be successful in their business, but they're also going to do something interesting in the communities that they come from. And that's what we've already seen it. We had the first round last year with 76 founders, and we've already seen, incredible metrics and stats and impact around what's happened since we were able to give them some dollars and some support, and really just seen it multiply. And we expect the same thing from the group that we just awarded. But something, again, in how we designed this thing was we don't have any expectations about getting money back. It's not a cash, it's not an equity exchange. And that's different than what you'll see, of course, with investment dollars from other folks, or loan programs that other people have. We put this money out with the understanding that we're not going to get it back, in cash, but we're going to get it back in the impact, and get it back in what these founders actually end up doing for the community. And as folks that are in the community, and of course Google has tentacles everywhere, that is what we're looking to see, and that's what we're tracking. So that to me has been the beauty of this program, is that there is no expectation about getting the money back. The expectation is that these founders go on and build great businesses and do great things in their community.
Let's go a level deeper there, Jewel, because I'm interested in, yes, it's the right thing to do, quote unquote, to invest in diverse founders and diverse leaders, whether that be executives or et cetera. But there's also a real return on investment, by putting your money in Black people, right? And so can you talk a little bit about how, for people who still struggle with, we're going to do it because it's the right thing to do. We got to get some Black people on our board of directors. We got to get some Black people, because if we don't, then the pitchforks will come out at us. But talk about a little bit about why it's great for shareholders. It's great for investors. It's great for business returns to have Black people at the seat.
Yeah, this is work that has been in my life for over a decade. When I first started at Google over 10 years ago, which I'm aging myself, or dating myself. This was research that we were doing as kind of our passion projects, or 20% time, was what does Google's book of business look like? And what we found at that time was that it wasn't extremely diverse, and Google was missing Black advertisers, was missing Black small business owners for various reasons. The message wasn't reaching them. And so that research has, even now 10 years later, is still relevant and true, where we see that there is a disconnect between Black-owned businesses adopting Google products, or Black-owned businesses knowing that you need to put your Google Places banner up to let people know that you're in business and what your hours are and all of this. And so with that in mind, there is a business imperative to helping these founders understand what they need to be doing online. And that's the business that we're in at Google, but making sure that they have the resources, they have the tools, they have the knowledge. And by proxy, they're growing and scaling their businesses, and hopefully, becoming customers at Google, and we're supporting them, and we're building up that ecosystem. That's the kind of the give on our side, is that the more people that are building great businesses online, there is going to be some funnel back at some point into the Google ecosystem. And so when I put together the business case for it, I talk about the fact that these businesses, as they grow and scale, will be great customers at some point, potentially, will be great partners at some point. Hopefully, my goal in the back of my head is that we have some companies from these batches that Google acquires at some point. And so really building up the ecosystem in such a way that we've done everything we can to support these businesses. And now we know the founders, the talent is there. It really just is a matter of, can we find them? And I'm on the job, so yes, we can find them. And then what resources can we give them? And so that's what, if we look at what's the business case for it, that's kind of what we put together as the business case.
Joey, in closing, and because at the risk of giving us another half an hour long conversation, I'm going to ask us to let's do this in like 3 minutes, because it's a big conversation, and it probably warrants its own podcast outside this. But I want to start it here. There was a tweet that you put up a few days ago and talked about how we have this conversation about big tech needing to be broken up politically. There's this conversation about that. And you talk about how that could actually impact minority-owned businesses. And I wonder if you could give us some caution to versus having these knee-jerk reactions when we see the balance sheets of these big companies, but actually to think strategically about how these political knee-jerk reactions could have a devastating effect on Black-owned companies, because they want to do business with Black-owned businesses as well. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, no, actually, I mean, at the end of the day, if we're talking about creating, wealth for Black entrepreneurs, we need to be able to sell to large companies. And I think even going to some a previous question you gave, I think we've seen the impact of someone like Jewel, quite honestly. Impact not only in Atlanta but across the national, I'm sure, global, ecosystem. And what happens if perhaps she doesn't sell to Parkit, I'm saying to another company, to sell Parkit to another company. And so, we need more jewels. I mean, if we can create more jewels of the world, quite honestly, just in America, the impact is going to be ridiculous. You've seen people going to become investors. You'll see people going to become the next generation of ecosystem developers. You'll see them launch programs at other large companies. You'll see people run for political office, quite honestly, because now they have the cachet to make things happen. So the impact is tremendous. If we take that opportunity away, it's going to hurt black people in general, but especially Black entrepreneurs.
So I'm super appreciative of both of you guys. Jewel, if you can give kind of like a closing statement on, the impact of the Google Fund, Startups for Black Founders Fund, and how people can get involved, how we can, potentially, join the programming. So give us kind of a rundown if you could.
Yeah, and I want to just hit on your point as far as the knee-jerk reactions. Of course, I see things on Twitter and I see what people have to say, and mostly, of course, overwhelmingly is positive, but people do have, I think they've gotten a little bit wrong around what responsibility companies like Google have and what they're actually doing with it. And I encourage people to really follow up and track who are the beneficiaries of some of this work. And, we have our website, g.co/Black Founders Fund, where you can read up on all 126 Black founders that have received this non-dilutive, equity-free funding, and the support and the cloud credits and the ad credits and all of the different things that we've put together for these founders. And you can track these founders and see what's happening with their businesses and see that they're not just stopping with us. They're going on, the last cohort went on to raise over $50 million collectively. And we expect this cohort to go on and raise 100 million plus. And so just track the work and see what's really happening, and then support the founders. It shouldn't stop with Google. It shouldn't stop with Goodie Nation. It really should be a community effort to make sure that these businesses have what they need and they are successful. So for future cohorts, follow, of course, Google for Startups. Follow me. I will always be posting about what we're doing. And of course, want to expand the community, expand the family, because we think that this is really impactful work. And me and Joe, we've been at this for a minute. So we've been thoughtful about putting together something that really is going to make a difference for the people, for this generation of founders.